Hello, this is Jalen, and this is the first activity of narrative paradigm. So there were 3 videos, but at first I want to touch on the second video about the woman who talks about how narratives is how we see the world. Um, there, she begins it with talking about how humans use stories to try to understand the world, but there's a part in there called narrative rationale where she talks about how the stories within themselves have to make sense, have to have logic. Even though we are storytellers first and logic users second, the stories themselves have to have logic behind them. And also, she talks about how they have to be believable and true. And she goes on to talk about the different types of stories we tell and how even subconsciously after a while we begin to recognize these stories and we kind of use that to see what's going to happen next and it's kind of how we see the world with the very few basic stories that she described to us, which leads me to the first video with the African woman from Nigeria. And she talks about how stories that she read as a child were from a culture that doesn't belong to her, that she's not a part of. And that affected her storytelling. And her storytelling had to evolve with more stories that she read, which I found very interesting, that the more stories we consume and the more stories we ingest and use, the more our storytelling evolves. Kind of like as we grow as people, so do our stories almost. But she goes on to talk about how when she finally went to school in America, she wrote a story and her professor didn't believe it was African enough because the stories that the professor had heard or read or whatnot about Africa did not match the story that she was telling, which is very interesting because she is from Africa, of course, but because of the stories he consumed, he didn't believe the story that she was trying to tell. And so the power of the story here is that we use stories to paint a narrative of something else, which leads us to our final video with the man who's trying to talk about how we read stories in the news and these stories have narrative, all right? They have, as he said, a suspect calls someone else for doing an activity. All the stories are layered and he breaks down the levels of the story and how we can take these stories and if we flip them around, they're not believable anymore, so we got to make them believable now. But that's not justice. However, that's not the point. What he was telling us in regard to narrative paradigm is that we are being told this narrative, this story, and over time it's what we believe to be true. And he tries to distinguish that this is not a race problem, that this is a crime problem, and over time it is being shown that he doesn't think that race is 100% at fault and not everything is about race, that this is about crime and how it's structurally told. But from the perspective of storytelling, he uses all these stories to try to find a common thread and a narrative that we can follow, which goes back to the first video, how we use stories to find logic. Because even though it logically doesn't make sense to be racist, even though it doesn't logically make sense for a man in America to tell someone from Africa that their story is an African, we have stories that make these things believable. And so we use that as our knowledge, as if these stories are real and are true. So what I learned here is that stories aren't just something we tell to pass the time, and they aren't just something we use to try to describe other things. It's something we use to try to understand something we don't know, which makes a story that's harmful and untrue very, very problematic, which makes stories about what Africa really isn't harmful to people from Africa. And what truly hurts is what makes stories about how the black community is being treated seem less important because of the surplus of stories about it that are being told. So it's this almost like this triangle we've created with power. It's if we tell too many stories that are the same, it becomes a stereotype. However, if we try to tell stories that are, important, but we oversupply it, then it becomes like the norm, like black men being shot that are unarmed. However, up top, if we don't tell these stories, we'll never learn. So I'm not sure what we do when it comes to storytelling and how we solve that or if that truly is a problem, or what we even do about it. What I do know is that stories have a way to shape what we know of this world, and that stories truly do have the power to influence others. Thank you.